The Imperial Japanese War Council made a terrifying calculation in 1942, one that permanently shelved their most audacious and secret war plan. This is the story of the three realities that made the conquest of America an impossible nightmare. In the euphoric, feverish weeks after the strike on Pearl Harbor, Japan's military leadership gathered around maps that told a story of breathtaking triumph. The mood in Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters wasn't just confident, it was messianic. They had done the impossible, striking a direct, crippling blow against the premier Pacific power. British strongholds in Asia were collapsing, Dutch resources were falling into their hands, and the American fleet was smoking ruins in Hawaii. A wave of what historians would later term victory disease swept through the command. This was more than optimism. It was a fundamental belief in Japanese spiritual supremacy. The samurai code of Bushido, they were certain, would always triumph over the soft, decadent, and individualistic materialism of the West. Their entire strategic doctrine, known as Kassen, was built on this idea. Win one monumental, decisive naval battle, and the Americans, perceived as merchants unwilling to sacrifice, would surely sue for a negotiated peace, leaving Japan master of the Pacific. Yet, in the midst of this clamor, one man sat in sober silence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the very architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, carried a secret burden of dread. He was a paradox, a Japanese nationalist who harbored a deep, well-informed fear of the nation he had just provoked. While his colleagues toasted to a short war, Yamamoto understood a longer, darker truth. He had not merely visited the United States as a diplomat, he had immersed himself in its culture. As a student at Harvard in the 1920s and later as a naval attaché in Washington, he had done something none of his fellow officers had. He had traveled the American interior. He had driven its endless roads, seen its sprawling farmlands in the Midwest, and witnessed the roaring, relentless industry of cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh. He spoke English, read American newspapers, and grasped a national psyche built on individualism and defiance. It's reported he wrote in his diary, with a prescience that would become legendary, that he feared all they had done was to rouse a slumbering titan and fill it with a terrible resolve. The High Command, emboldened by their string of victories, soon began to ask the ultimate, strategic question. If one decisive battle could force America to the negotiating table, what would total victory look like? Their gaze moved east across the Pacific, toward the coastline of California. The ultimate prize, the ultimate demonstration of their destiny, a full-scale invasion of the continental United States. When they pressed Yamamoto for his assessment, the answer he delivered was a masterclass in strategic intelligence that went far beyond ships and troop counts. It was a chilling analysis structured in 3 terrifying layers, each one a deeper and more insurmountable barrier than the last. Yamamoto began by shattering a fundamental cultural assumption. In 1940s Japan, the relationship between the state and the individual was one of hierarchical obedience, especially in matters of defense. Following the Meiji Restoration, the government had systematically disarmed the populace. The warrior classes' swords were confiscated. Firearm ownership was a rare privilege tightly controlled by the state. The military held a monopoly on organized violence. To the generals in Tokyo, war was a transaction between professional armies. Once you defeated the enemy's soldiers and captured its capital, the civilian population would, by default, submit. Yamamoto explained that America operated on an entirely different principle, born from its revolution and hardened by its frontier history. He described what he had witnessed firsthand: hardware stores in small towns where rifles were sold alongside hammers and nails, sporting goods shops where ammunition was as readily available as fishing tackle. This was not a nation where arms were the exclusive domain of the state. It was a culture where marksmanship was a common skill, taught from father to son, a point of pride and a practical tradition. He cited intelligence estimates that, while imprecise, pointed to a staggering figure. In a nation of roughly 130 million people, there were believed to be between 40 and 50 million firearms in private hands. The generals might have dismissed this, arguing civilians were not trained soldiers, but Yamamoto's famous rebuke, paraphrased in history as the warning that There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass, painted a strategic horror story. An invasion would not mean facing a uniformed army on a defined battlefield. It would mean triggering a continent-sized insurgency. Every farmhouse could conceal a sniper. Every wooded ridge could hide an ambush. Every town's police chief and hunting club could become the nucleus of a resistance cell. The Imperial Japanese Army, trained for set-piece battles and jungle warfare, would be thrust into a grinding, endless guerrilla conflict against millions of independent actors. There would be no central command to surrender, no single flag to capture. How do you break the will of 100 million people fighting for their own homes? On their own land? This was the first impossibility, a social structure that turned every citizen into a potential combatant. Let's assume Yamamoto might have continued, that Japan was willing to endure that horrific, sprawling conflict. Let's say the spirit of Bushido could overcome millions of armed homesteaders. The next layer of the problem was cold, hard and unyielding, the brutal mathematics of geography. He would have unrolled a map of the United States next to one of Japan. Japan is an archipelago roughly the size of California. The continental United States is a behemoth, stretching over 3,000 miles from the Pacific to the Atlantic. An invasion force landing on the west coast would not be capturing a capital. It would be starting a transcontinental death march. Their objective to seize the industrial and governmental heartlands lay thousands of miles to the east. The journey would be a gauntlet of natural fortresses. Immediately, invading troops would confront the Sierra Nevada, a massive granite wall. Forcing passes, there would be a bloody, slow-motion slaughter. Beyond that lay the desolate, waterless expanses of the Mojave and Great Basin deserts, where an army would wither under the sun and be picked apart by raiders. Then, the crown jewel of defensive terrain, the Rocky Mountains, a continent-spanning range that could make the Alps look like foothills. Even if, by some miracle, an army survived all that, they would emerge onto the Great Plains, 1,000 miles of open ground where they would be exposed and vulnerable, their supply lines stretched to a thread. And that was the ultimate trap: supply. Every bullet, every sack of rice, every drop of fuel for tanks and trucks would have to travel 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. From the Japanese home islands, that supply line would be a shooting gallery for the recovering and increasingly vengeful US Navy and its submarine corps. The journey would take weeks and losses would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, the Americans wouldn't need a single trans-Pacific convoy. They had the most advanced internal logistics network on Earth, a vast, interconnected web of railroads and highways. They could move entire armies from the factories of the East Coast to the front lines in California. In a matter of days, fully equipped and fed, the Japanese force would be a stranded, isolated island, starving in the middle of a hostile continent, while their enemy grew stronger and closer to its sources of power with every mile they advanced. The land itself was a passive, monstrous ally to the defenders. Yet, for Yamamoto, even the armed populace and the impossible geography were secondary symptoms of a deeper, more terrifying truth. The core of his warning was economic and industrial. He had to correct the High Command's most dangerous miscalculation, the belief that destroying the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor had crippled American power. Yamamoto knew America's true strength wasn't in its fleet and being, but in its dormant capacity to build fleets. He had seen the seeds of this during his travels. The automobile plants of Detroit weren't just car factories, they were latent weapons factories of unimaginable scale. He presented the hard numbers, the kind that win or lose modern wars. In 1941, the United States produced about 63 million tons of steel, roughly half of the entire world's output. Japan produced about 7 million. America pumped over 60% of the world's oil from its own soil. Japan had almost none, which was the very reason for its desperate southern expansion. This wasn't a minor disadvantage, it was an existential chasm. When America's arsenal of democracy switched to a war footing, the results defied Japanese comprehension. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, applying automotive assembly line principles to aviation, would eventually produce a B-2 Liberator heavy bomber every hour. Shipbuilder Henry Kaiser's yards revolutionized production, building Liberty cargo ships in weeks, then days. The SS Robert E. theory was famously launched just for days and 15 hours after its keel was laid. Japan would celebrate the completion of a new aircraft carrier. As a national achievement taking years, America would soon be launching one every month. This was the true sleeping giant, not the military, but the collective might of its workers, engineers and farmers. A war of attrition against such a productive behemoth was not a war at all, it was national suicide. Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan was a desperate Hail Mary to win quickly, precisely because he knew Japan could not survive the long game against this industrial tsunami. Yamamoto's analysis was conclusive. The invasion plan was not just difficult, it was a fantasy. The council shelved it, and Japan turned its ambitions to consolidating a defensive perimeter. But the story holds a profound and dark irony. Yamamoto's strategic insight that an armed, determined populace makes conquest untenably bloody would return to haunt his own nation. By mid-1945, with Japan's navy destroyed and its cities burning, the United States faced its own invasion nightmare. Operation Downfall, the planned assault on the Japanese home islands. American planners, studying the fanatical resistance on Iwo Jima and Okinawa where casualties were catastrophic and surrender was rare, realized Japan was preparing to become the very nation of riflemen Yamamoto had described. The Japanese Ketsugo defense plan called for the total mobilization of society. Schools were dissolved. Civilians, men, women, and children were trained with bamboo spears, kitchen knives, and improvised explosives. The directive was national suicide, to exact such a horrific toll on the invading Americans that they would lose the will to fight and negotiate a peace. US military estimates were staggering. Projected American casualties for the invasion ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million. Japanese military and civilian deaths were estimated in the tens of millions. This grim arithmetic, the direct result of Japan adopting the armed populace defense, formed the terrible context for President Truman's decision in August 1945. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were seen through this lens, as a way to avoid an invasion that would have dwarfed the carnage of the entire war in Europe. In a horrific twist of fate, Japan's own strategy validated Yamamoto's original thesis on its own shores, demonstrating that the defense he feared for America could make invasion so costly as to be unthinkable, forcing an even more terrible alternative. The tale of Japan's abandoned invasion is more than a historical what-if. It's a timeless lesson in the multi-dimensional nature of national power. True security is not found in a single battleship or a single army. It is woven from the complex fabric of society itself, the spirit and independence of its people, the formidable natural advantages of its geography, and the awesome, latent power of its economic engine. Yamamoto's genius was to see these layers clearly, while his contemporaries saw only flags on a map. His warning reminds us that the most formidable defenses are often not at the border, but in the character of the nation within. If you found this deep dive into the calculations that shape history compelling, please help support this channel. Smash that like button, subscribe to Winds of Thought, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of history's pivotal decisions. We thrive on your engagement. Now, we turn the analysis over to you. In your view, which of Yamamoto's three layers was the most decisive deterrent? Was it the specter of an armed citizenry, the insurmountable logistics of America's geography, or the overwhelming fear of its industrial might? Let's discuss in the comments below. We read every single one.